The idea for the Outlander, there were a number of factors that got me writing that book, and but the original kernel, and I think this happens to a lot of writers, is I had one single kind of vision, an image actually, and the image was of this very young woman dressed entirely in black, running like hell. As with any of these kinds of things, it came packed with a certain number of kind of ineffable things that I already knew about the character and I already knew about the setting, and for me, clearly it was historical. It was back in time a little bit. And the first thing I did was I wrote a poem, and the poem's called Mary, and the poem was published in a book called Ashland. You know, in retrospect, I now have a sense that I wasn't finished with the story, and it is essentially, the poem itself is very similar, at least at the beginning. And so I took the poem and I started writing a novel, and from the first sentence of the book to the last sentence of the book took 10 years. I find that it's easier for me, and I don't know if other writers have this, it's easier for me to write about something, to write about cold when it's the summer. I'm more likely to write about cold when I'm not cold, because the full, all of my imagination is required in order for me to create that world. You know, I don't really have to go out and see and feel what it feels like to be cold in order to write about it. It's much better if I access it entirely through imagination. So, in a weird way, being in Toronto, in my apartment, you know, year after year, and yet living in this novel set in the Rockies was pretty perfect. Since I've finished my novel, I've been asking other novelists, so what do you feel like after you've done this? What's it like? How do you start a new one? How do you deal with the fact that you're unspeakably self-conscious about, you know, you've got things like this where you're talking about yourself, and you know, if you're like me, you're allergic to it. So, you know, how do you handle that? And then how do you make the step to, you know, after 10 years, doing something new? What do you do? And most people talk about this kind of impossible to describe little itch that they've got. Like one person described it as a throb. It's hard to say where you're going to end up ever when you're writing. But for me, for some reason, I am actually starting to think of the area outside of Toronto, lakes and woods, sort of northern Ontario area, and so maybe that topography will become important, but I don't know yet.